Hello, and welcome to Lesson 23, The Psychology of Everyday Things. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to describe the following concepts from the design of everyday things: affordances, mappings, metaphors, transfer effects, mental model, system image, and gulfs of execution and evaluation. You'll be able to critique a user interface using these concepts, and list trade-offs for using a metaphor for a given system. Let's start with the movie. I'm realizing I should have had more cute baby videos in my slides. So what's going on here? Well, using some of the language you already know in the class, we might know that this is an example of affordances. An affordance is the perceived and actual properties of an object that determine how it could possibly be used. One classic example is this, the masochist teapot that Don Norman likes to use. You can imagine how it might work, but you're not very happy about it. Let's hear Don Norman himself talk about these concepts.
Affordances is a technical term, sometimes hard to get, but it's really quite simple. Affordances refers to the properties of an object and the person. It's the relationship between the object and the person and what the person can do with that object. For example, what is this? Peculiar shape, peculiar object, but it has practical affordances. For example, it affords support. It's a chair, see? Very comfortable chair. In fact, as long as it supports me and is about the right size, I could use it to stand on. Rolls a bit, but it affords support, affords standing. In fact, it affords lifting, and therefore throwing. I could throw it at you. And hiding, see? It does not afford the passage of light. Therefore, it makes me invisible, useful to hide against. Lots of affordances come with objects that you wouldn't expect. So suppose I had a book. Handy, small, can hold in my hand. Obviously, it affords reading and turning the pages, but other things that you might not have thought about, like scratching, like if it's raining, protection against the elements. The pages, keep your place, fold down the page. Or need to make a note, rip out a page. It affords ripping, affords writing. Many affordances. The value of a well-designed object is when it has such a rich set of affordances that the people who use it can do things with it that the designer never imagined.
Going back to our example with babies trying to pinch zoom on images, if the display is not touch sensitive, even though the screen affords touching, touching has no effect. For example, a graphical object on the screen, does it afford clicking? Well, yes, you can click on anything on the screen, but the question is not can you click on it, but whether does the user perceive this affordance? Does the user recognize that clicking on the icon is a meaningful, useful action? One way to think about affordances is comparing them to signifiers. Affordances are the possible interactions between people and the environment. Some affordances are perceivable, others are not. And as an interaction designer, you really want to be able to create the perception that your affordances are there so that people know what to do with the system that they have in front of them. Perceived affordances are what an environment appears to support, and they act as signifiers. That means they signal what you can do with it, but they can also be ambiguous. Signifiers signal things, in particular what actions are possible and how they should be done. Signifiers must be perceivable or else they fail to function. So for example, a button on a screen appears to be 3D to afford pressing. And it does this because if there's an analogy between the real world where a 3D protruding object is something that you can often press. Now, another important technical term is mapping that comes up in the design of everyday things. Mapping is also a technical term, borrowed from mathematics, meaning the relationship between elements of two sets of things. The classic example is to look at dials or controls for a stove. So here you have a set of different dials, and each of them maps to the temperature in one of the different 4 arrangements. And do you think this is a good mapping or a good arrangement? Not really. You have to have this additional labeling to identify where things are. So you can have different layouts to show these mapped controls. They could be arbitrary. So in this case, you have 4 knobs. They're just equidistant in a flat hierarchy, and there's 24 different possibilities for how these mappings could happen. They require visible labels and memory, and if anyone's ever turned the wrong hot plate on a stove, you have used a mapping that was not very usable. You could look at paired mappings. There are 2 possibilities per side, so there are 4 total possibilities. So this greatly reduces the search space or the possible mapping space. And this way, you are less likely to do the wrong action. You can start to think about what happens there. And you could think about a full mapping. Here, you've got a full arrangement that is mirrored in the control space as well as the output or system space. And there, this way, you have a much higher likelihood of being able to see what the mappings are. It's 1-to-1 in this case, and that's represented visually and through locations. For devices and appliances, natural mappings use constraints and correspondences in the physical world. For example, controls on a stove or in a car. The radio knob goes left to right to control volume. It could also go in and out to represent rear speakers, front and rear speakers. So if you want to fade forward and back, you could go back and forward, and then maybe if you pan, it could go left and right. And that would be a very natural mapping, I think. For computers and digital interfaces, mapping between the controls and their actions of the computer is what you have to worry about. So the controls on a digital watch, which for old school digital watches is pretty arbitrary. But for things with a display, smartwatches, it might be a little bit more intuitive. Or controls on a word processor program. You have these different tools and they map to what you can do in the system, and they often try and signify what you can do with that tool through iconography or other different signals to the user. One term that's come up in this course a bunch that we haven't thought critically about so far are mental models. A mental model represents a person's thought process for how something works. For example, a person's understanding of the surrounding world or of something embedded within that world. Mental models are based on incomplete facts, past experiences, and even intuitive perceptions. And all this is from Carey 1986. So, for example, does this work? No, it doesn't. You couldn't ride these bicycles, right? Our mental models of how bicycles work can simulate how this works, even without touching it or trying it out. Just looking at this image, you can imagine, okay, I know if I pedal on one of these bicycles, it goes forward, but if they're both there, they'll be pushing against each other, and so you couldn't ride this as a tandem bicycle. Mental models are built from affordances, constraints, mappings, positive transfer effects, so when you have interacted with a similar interface in the past and it transfers to help you inform how to use something. Negative transfer would be if it taught you to do the wrong thing, and so if you've ever been clicking the wrong button between, let's say, Zoom or WebEx or other video chat systems, it's because you've been trained on one system, and then on a similar system, the mappings are different or the controls or models are different, and that can lead to mistakes. Cultural associations are standards, so it depends where you are and what kind of culture you're embedded in. Instructions, interactions, all sorts of ways. We construct these mental models through all sorts of interactions with a system. And mental models are often wrong. What you have in the head is not necessarily what the designer wanted to do. You have the designer's conceptual model. Remember when we talked a little bit about conceptual design? This is how things work in the mind of the designer and how they intend things to work. And then you have the mental model that the user develops through interaction with the system. By interacting with this coffee maker, they have an idea of how things work. But you can see the layout of what the designer's thinking about and what the person using the coffee maker is thinking about isn't quite the same. It might be similar, but the user's conceptual model is incomplete. And the way that it's mediated is through the physical structure that has been built, or the perceived structure that's been built. This is called the system image. This is documentation, instructions, and labels. So everything, so they might be reading the documentation, they may be trying to interact with the coffee maker, they may have other memories of how to work with coffee makers that are similar, and all of that is how you, the system image kind of articulates this by maybe trying to evoke a standard coffee maker look, or by using affordances or all these other signifiers to tell people how to interact with it. And that's how you, as a designer, are able to communicate with the user. So what's critical that you realize as you design interactive systems is you cannot directly control the user's conceptual model or the mental model that the user has come up with. You have your own mental model of how this works, and you need to learn how to render or communicate that to the user so that they can form a complete as possible and correct as possible mental model. So often this course I have a pre-reading. If you read through the Don Norman book, The Design of Everyday Things, there's a fridge example of how people interact with a refrigerator. And Norman illustrates there's two different controls. There's a freezer and a refrigerator. And one model might be how you control the temperature in the freezer and how you control the temperature in the refrigerator. That could be one mental model, and that might be what you often assume, but it might be implemented in a different way. For example, you have a freezer that just changes the temperature sensor of how something will freeze. And so you have this cold air valve that's changing where the cold air is going. So it's more of a relative ratio of the cooling, degree of cooling between the two systems. And, on the system image looks the same for both of these mental models, but the way that the system actually works is really quite different. And so it's difficult to figure that out. Same thing with thermostats and thermometers, for example. Oftentimes there's a standard way of doing things. It's a bang-bang controller that tries to arrive at a certain position. But if you have a different kind of furnace, or you have a different kind of thermostat or a smart thermostat, then suddenly it interacts in a different way. And so these assumptions are no longer valid. Let's use an example from a hotel I was in a couple of years ago. This was in Brooklyn, actually, and it had this setup. Yes, the shower is in with the toilet is in the shower. It was a very small, minimal-ish hotel to stay in. And to control the shower, you have this interface right here. And because it's kind of difficult to see from the slides in the picture, there is a marking here that looks like this, and a marking here that looks like this. So what is your mental model of this interface? So now it's your turn. Follow the instructions on Learn to describe your mental model of this system, what you see right here, using the vocabulary that we've talked about. Take 5 minutes to do so, and I'll wait.